56. Either 56 or 99. I can't. Oh, shit. Okay, sorry. I got it.
Welcome to the Candidate Forum put on by the League of Women Voters of Arlington Heights. My name is Louisa Zanin, and I am from the League of Women Voters of Arlington Heights, Mount Prospect, Buffalo Grove. I am also a member of our Emerging Leaders program. Founded in 1920 out of the suffragette movement giving women the right to vote, League of Women Voters is a non-partisan organization that neither supports nor opposes candidates or parties for any office. The League's purpose is to promote political responsibility through the informed and active participation of citizens in the government. Providing this forum allows citizens to become better informed about the issues facing their community and to become better acquainted with the candidates running for office. We are happy to provide this service for our community. To send in questions for the candidates, please text 224-306-9521 or email voter.lwvah@gmail.com. All of the candidates were contracted by email and phone prior to today. The candidates have agreed to abide by the ground rules provided by the League of Women Voters. They are as follows. Candidates have flipped a coin to determine speaking order. The moderator will rotate this order during the forum for questions. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for introductions. Next, each candidate will have 1 minute to answer questions. At the end, each candidate will have a 2-minute closing. League members will act as timers. Candidates will be given a 30-second and 15-second warning, so we ask the candidates to quickly complete their thoughts before they see the stop card. Time limits will be enforced out of respect for all candidates. Questions will be provided by the audience. Each question will be answered by all candidates, so please, audience, ask questions that pertain to all. Again, we only use questions that can be answered by all candidates. Again, please send questions to 224-306-9521 or email voter.lwvah@gmail.com. Questions will be reviewed by League volunteers for clarity, appropriateness, and to avoid duplication. Candidates have been asked not to interrupt one another. The moderator will repeat a question if asked. The candidates are to speak to the audience. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's event, Felix Garkish.
Thank you so much, Louisa. We will now start our candidate forum. We ask that you bear with us and note that technology is what it is. We are all working our best to ensure that this runs as smoothly as possible. With me on screen, we have our candidates, our ASL interpreter, Stacy Shine Stapleton, and our timer, League board member, Connie Wiseman. I would like to note that the Q&A chat has been disabled for all attendees, so if you would like to submit a question for the candidates, please text this number, 224-306-9521, or email voter.lwvah@gmail.com. Once again, text 224-306-9521 or email voter.lwvah@gmail.com. We will start this forum with candidate Tom Morrison, candidate for the Illinois representative in the 9th Congressional District. Going second will be our other candidate, Maggie Trevor. And then the candidates have agreed to abide by the rules set forth prior to this forum. They will each present a 2-minute introductory statement. The order to start was determined by coin toss. The candidate who opens first will be the last to respond in closing. Then, questions obtained from the audience and vetted by our volunteers will be asked, and each candidate will have 1 minute to respond in alternating order. Each question will be answered by all candidates, so please, audience, ask questions that pertain to all. Again, we only use questions which can be answered by all candidates. Closing statements will be 2 minutes. League of Women Voters will League of Women Voters members will keep time, and candidates, I will ask that you please adhere to those time limits. Candidates, please notice the timer. When you see the stop sign, you may finish your sentence. Candidate Morrison will open first, candidate Trevor will close first, and then we will alternate the question order. So, without further ado, our first question today for introductions. So, candidate Morrison, would you please give your introduction?
Yeah, thank you very much, Felix, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for having us for this forum. I'm State Representative Tom Morrison. I represent the 54th District, and I am a proud Palatine resident of 17 years. I've represented our district since 2011, and my yard signs around town say the tax fighter, because this is one of the major issues that is facing our state right now. Anybody, any candidate, any elected official who's really listening to voters right now knows that the property taxes, the state of Illinois, the public corruption that is going on, it is becoming more and more intolerable. And so I'm running for re-election again because I've been a consistent fighter for taxpayers, for residents, for voters in our district. I have proudly stood up to the public corruption. I have proudly stood up to Speaker Madigan and those closest allied with him. And I've been endorsed by the Daily Herald once again. The Tribune has not released their endorsements yet, but prior to this, I've been endorsed by the Tribune every single election. And I've also been endorsed by a number of business groups. This year, I was named the 2020 Legislator of the Year by the Illinois Coalition of Community Blood Centers. So I am very proud of my involvement in our community, supporting our non-for-profits, and again, standing up for taxpayers and painting a vision for what our state could be and should be for the residents, for the businesses, for the families that live here. And so I look forward to the questions. I look forward to this debate, if you will, this community's forum. And thanks again.
All right, thank you, candidate Morrison. Candidate Trevor, if you would like to please deliver your opening statement.
Yeah, my name is Maggie Trevor, and if I seem familiar to you, it's probably because I ran for this office 2 years ago. I lost to Tom by 43 votes. I am the poster child for every vote counts. Also, many of you may be familiar with me because I'm from this area. My parents were original residents of Rolling Meadows, and I was born and raised here. I'm a product of District 15 elementary schools. I went to Rolling Meadows High School, and the public education that I got here gave me a tremendous start in life. I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry from University of Chicago. I was able to get it in 3 years, in large part because of the head start that I got at Rolling Meadows High School. I worked as a chemist for a couple of years at UIC College of Pharmacy before going to graduate school in political science, also at the University of Chicago. I have a master's and PhD in that subject. I spent some time at Harvard Government Data Center before teaching at a public university, University of Iowa, for a number of years in political science. I left the academia in 1999 to embark on a career in the business world where I, for the most part, did healthcare market research. I came back to this community to start my own business at the beginning of 2015. And that breadth of experience that I have is what I want to draw on to represent you in Springfield. I want to fight for affordable healthcare. I understand the insurance industry. I want to fight for public education and public education funding. I want to fight for women's reproductive rights. And I want to fight for equal rights for all. And I think I bring the background to be able to do that effectively from day one.
Thank you, candidate Trevor. So now, for real this time, we will start with our first question. So since candidate Morrison started with our opening statements, candidate Trevor, you will be the first one to respond to this one. Your question is, what is your stance on limiting political contributions to human beings and not organizations?
I am for substantial campaign finance reform, including limiting contributions to human beings. Currently, because of Citizens United, unfortunately, at the federal level, our hands are tied. Given that, I also will say that I have taken contributions from organizations, as has Tom Morrison, because unfortunately we kind of have to fight this particular fight under the rules that exist now. But I think that the degree of influence of money in politics has gotten out of hand. I think that the current ComEd scandal is a clear example of that. We need to have some kind of effective reform so that the entities that need to be regulated by state legislators are not basically influencing our election.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison, would you like?
Thank you. Again, you can look, any resident can look up on the Illinois Board of Elections website how much money and who has given to various candidates and causes. And so what we saw in 2018 was just obscene amounts of money being spent. Actually, frankly, starting with J.B. Pritzker, who spent about $170 million on his campaign. But then you also had the influence of Speaker Madigan and his political action committees that dumped about $1.4 million into Maggie Trevor's campaign. Then you had hundreds of thousands of dollars that came from other Democratic candidates. You had other allied groups to the Speaker's office. And it is unnecessary. If we had more forums like this, I think it would elevate the discussion. I think it would be better for voters. One last thing I'll say is that the national discussion has just overwhelmed these important local and state positions. And so candidate forums like this are really helpful to kind of bring it home and how this impacts our day-to-day lives.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Our next question is, what will you do to fix the pension problem in Illinois? Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Yeah, well, I led on this issue from day one. One thing I learned when I ran my cleaning business is you never ask employees to do anything that you're unwilling to do yourself. And so I recognize that the politicians from both parties, frankly, have overpromised. They've given promises to our public employees. They've also hidden liabilities from taxpayers in terms of our pension debt. And so it continues to climb in a best case scenario, we're looking at about $137 billion right now in just the 5-state pension plans. So I was the first Illinois legislator to opt out of the public sector pension program. And I did that because I wanted to lead by example and go to our public employees and taxpayers and say, look, this is not sustainable. Let's fix it on a go forward basis. So to be clear, what credits our public employees have earned up to today, we need to lock those in. But on a go forward basis, we have to start moving employees into a defined contribution system to give taxpayers confidence that we're not just going to keep going after taxpayers to fund these pensions.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Candidate Trevor, what will you do to fix the pension problem in Illinois?
Well, first of all, a couple of things. There has been pension reform, and Tom likes to talk about the fact that he was the first representative to not take a pension. But the thing is he came in January of 2011. All state employees who came in after January of 2011 are on tier 2, which is so stingy that in fact it may be creating a problem, several problems for the state down the road in that it will lose our Social Security exemption, as well as result in retention problems for employees. We need to amortize the debt that we have. We have to pay our pension debt. It's a legal obligation. And that needs to be dealt with as any other kind of debt. And we have to make it a payment. We have to finance it and pay it off over a period of time so that it's a smaller and smaller portion of the state budget as we move forward in time. So.
I'd like to use one of my rebuttals if I could.
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, so to my response, if tier 2 is so stingy, a number of legislators continue to opt into the system. And they do that because it's still a defined benefit pension. It still involves health insurance once they're retired. And again, if we don't fix our pension problems, it's just going to continue to crowd out necessary funding for current K through 12 education needs, current higher education needs, current human service needs. And so we absolutely have to get pension reform done. So many residents have said, why hasn't it gotten done? And we need more pension reform champions in the legislature, and I'm proud to be one.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Our next question will be, should climate action be a top priority? And what is your plan to keep all Americans safe from a changing climate? Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
First of all, I am a strong advocate. I unlike my opponent, I firmly believe in the science of climate change. I am a supporter of the Clean Energy Jobs Act, not only because it moves us forward in controlling carbon emissions in the atmosphere, but also because it provides us a chance to create jobs in an industry that is our future. We need to invest in clean energy in this state in order to limit carbon emissions and help save the environment.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison.
Yeah, I'd like to remind people that Illinois is one of 50 states, and the United States is one of 100 plus countries in the world. And so we have to be careful not to impose very costly restrictions on just our residents when it would have almost zero impact on the world's environment. And so you can just look at states like California that have very aggressively moved towards renewable energy standards, mandates. And the problem is what happens when the wind stops blowing or when the solar component is not sufficient to provide the energy needs for a state. You have rolling blackouts, which obviously impairs human life, could threaten human life, certainly is bad for industry and people's jobs that are absolutely critical. And so I think we continue to move in a cleaner direction, but just imposing expensive, burdensome mandates is just going to hurt our own residents and drive costs up.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Okay, so our next question is, if the fair tax referendum fails to pass, how and where should cuts be made? Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Yep. Well, I voted no against this graduated tax proposal. I have voted no against other tax increases. Again, that's why my moniker is the tax fighter. I'm one of only two in the entire state of Illinois legislature to get a 100% score, because they judge us on our tax votes, but also on our spending votes. And for years, I have seen the Democratic leadership in Illinois, they just continue to authorize new spending, new programs, when we can't even afford the existing ones. And so what do we do to get our fiscal house in order? We have got to create policies that enable state and local governments to operate more efficiently. And that includes our higher education, state government, our K-12 education system, pension reform, as I mentioned, Medicaid reform so that it is truly providing for those who absolutely need it. We have to do those things because we continue to lose population. Our tax base is eroding, which means that tax burden is going to fall on those of us who stay.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Candidate Trevor?
First of all, I am for the fair tax because all other forms of taxation, including property tax, works out to be regressive on the population. And I think that the fair tax gives us tools to deal with our state spending problems. Now, given that it might fail, we have some very, very hard decisions to make. Now, cutting revenue across the board isn't necessarily the right thing to do. We have to look at the trade-offs. And Tom Morrison actually just mentioned something that I think is a classic example of that trade-off. I've heard him say over the years how he thinks we should be cutting Medicaid. Medicaid is problematic because if every dollar that we spend on Medicaid, we get 9 from the federal government. It was part of the ACA expansion, and it keeps people insured, and it keeps people out of the county health systems. Uninsured care for the county health systems before the Affordable Care Act cost us $222 million more. And where does that hit us? It hits us in property taxes. There's a cost benefit analysis, unfortunately, that's going to have to be done when we have to deal, if we have to deal with those kinds of cuts.
Thank you, candidate Trevor. Our next question is, what would you do to keep residents from fleeing our state? Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
Well, I think there's some myths about who's leaving. The people who are leaving predominantly are people in middle and lower income categories, and it is because the tax burden is unfair here. It's not because the overall tax burden is high, it's because we're taxing lower and middle class people. Another reason why I've heard people tell me that they want to leave is because they have kids that they have to send to college. And it's so expensive to do it here that it's cheaper to move to another state to put your kids through college right now. It's also uncertainty with regard to MAPS grants that has its roots in the budget crisis. We need to make sure that we properly fund education. We need to make sure that we restructure our taxes so that lower and middle income people don't bear a disproportionate burden of taxes in this state. That's how we're going to keep people here.
Thank you, candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison?
And what I hear about constantly from residents is their overall tax burden is unaffordable. And when you hear the proponents of the tax increases talk, they talk as if there are these different buckets. You have to look at the overall tax burden, and between property taxes, fees, the income taxes, in total, it is creating an overwhelming burden for a lot of our residents. And if they can move, a lot of them are choosing to move. Some of them are being forced to move, and we're breaking up families. We're forcing people to replant in new areas, whether they like it or not. And it's wrong. And you don't hear from Democratic leadership about reform on how we spend current revenues. So it's not a matter of cutting revenues. They just keep adding to the revenue burden. They don't talk about cutting and reforming how the money is spent. And the last thing is the public corruption. There's so many people who just say, you know what, as long as those same characters are running the show, we don't think that there's going to be a change.
Thank you, candidate Morrison. Our next question is, if there exists diversity of thought within the scientific community, what does follow the science mean? And should politics influence scientific conclusions? Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Well, I'm not sure what the questioner's intent is on that or the context, but it's important for us to listen to a variety of voices. I mean, the number one issue I hear about from residents right now has to do with COVID-19 and the science around that. And it appears as though our governor is solely focused on COVID-19 and scientists, epidemiologists that are tasked with dealing with that, rather than the totality of scientists who are saying, well, there are other public health issues that need to be considered. There are psychologists and psychiatrists and drug addiction specialists and those who are dealing with domestic violence and the development of children and their health and mental health and physical health. And all of those things need to be factored into the decisions of policymakers. I've been pushing hard for the legislature to assume its proper role in being a check and balance on our governor, who has just been running the state of Illinois by executive order.
Thank you, candidate Morrison. Candidate Trevor.
Well, addressing the original question, which I believe was the diversity of opinions in science, scientific method is a process, and the research is peer-reviewed, and it's a building, ever-changing body of knowledge, and it's essentially a learning process. We need, and COVID is a good example of it. We have been learning about this disease as we go along. But there is a process that we need to recognize with science that gives us the best information given the evidence that we've got. And usually when there is a diversity of opinion, one or the other side may be, is more adequately supported by the evidence that's there. I think Pritzker's done an excellent job of finding, of developing policy based on evidence, and also taking into account the business community and all the other needs that we need to weigh in those processes as well. So.
Thank you, candidate Trevor. Our next question is the Illinois Senate, sorry, let me start that over. The Illinois Senate established term limits for its leaders in 2017. Do you support term limits for the Speaker and Minority Leader of the House? Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
Yes, I don't need a minute. I think that we should have term leaders on, term limits on House leadership. Absolutely.
All right, thank you for your response. Candidate Morrison, you have a
It's
minute.
an easy one too. I've filed legislation that would limit that, and your viewers wouldn't be surprised to hear that the speaker just shelved that bill. It's not even getting consideration. So you're looking at a Speaker of the House who is the longest serving speaker in United States history. He is also the only legislative chamber leader that also runs the state party apparatus and the purse strings. So candidates have to go to him if they want to advance their career or get party support. And I know Maggie will probably say, well, you know, the speaker didn't recruit her to run, but she's certainly taken millions of dollars from him and his closest allies in order to wage a campaign here. Jaw-dropping amounts of money in a district that's basically the size of Palatine Township.
I would like to use one of my rebuttals.
Sure. You have each one rebuttal left, just so you know.
I want to point out to everybody that Tom Morrison, on a couple of occasions, including earlier in this forum, has said that I've taken money directly from Michael Madigan. I haven't. I've taken support from the Democratic Party, just as he said, and also the House Democratic Organization. And Tom Morrison has taken lots of money from both organizations, including this campaign cycle. We are both the nominees of our party. That is the way it works. And no, it isn't completely controlled by one person on either side. We are both the nominees. And I would wish that Tom Morrison would stop misportraying that in his publications.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Speaker Madigan is the chairman of both the Democratic Party of Illinois Political Action Committee and also Democratic Majority Political Action Committee. So those are factual statements.
All right, thank you for both of your responses. Our next question is, do you support school choice? Why or why not? Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Yeah, I do support school choice. And I think what we're seeing right now with the COVID-19 crisis is it's absolutely shining a bright light on the need for our education systems and state and local policy to do what's best for students and parents. And that means the greatest flexibility possible. I mean, we have award-winning public schools in this area, but we also know that in light of the current crisis, it's not working for everybody. And so having as much flexibility as possible benefits our students, it benefits parents, it benefits society as a whole. And so I am proud of my record on the issue of choice in education. I'm a former 5th grade teacher. I taught for 6 years. I'm also a parent of 4 children, 3 of which are school aged. And so I think we got to do what's best for our students and parents. And frankly, the teachers benefit as well when we have more flexibility.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. And I would just like to remind you, I don't think I got a chance to say that, but your response to Candidate Trevor, that counted as your second rebuttal. So just to clear the any confusion, Candidate Trevor, you have 1 rebuttal left, and Candidate Morrison, you have used both of your rebuttals. So Candidate Trevor, I'll just repeat the question so that we don't get off topic here. Do you support school choice? Why or why not?
It depends how you define school choice. I think that you should have some choice in where you send your children to school. However, public schools are a service and a government function that is available to all families in the district. Very often those schools that parents might opt to send their children to that are not part of this public school system have the ability to exclude children. Also, public education is not it's kind of a lumpy good. In other words, you can't just take out a small portion, 1/30 of what you pay a school teacher because you're taking one student out of the classroom. So you need to fully fund public education, and being able to opt out of perhaps the paying a portion of your taxes to fund private school education for your child, I think should not be allowed, because it diminishes the ability for communities to provide public education for all.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Our next question is, do you support the 1776 Commission that promotes patriotic education? Why or why not? And Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
I have to admit to this one, having seen the headlines and not gotten into the details about it, it makes me nervous about what I do know about it makes me nervous about crossing the line between civic education, which I am a strong proponent of, and indoctrination of one viewpoint about history. I know that there has been pushback for introduction of lots of instructional material. I think a lot of the progress that we've made in recent decades of presenting multiple viewpoints of history has created a bit of a backlash. And we have to be careful here about censoring education for school students.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison.
I've been very focused on this race and what's going on here in terms of state policy, so I don't know a lot about this project. Here's what I do know, that America is the greatest country on earth. We have been so blessed by our forefathers for creating a system where we can even have a discussion like this, where we have fundamental human rights like freedom of speech and freedom to gather and worship, and have a free enterprise system, to have self-government. And the attacks on our fundamental institutions, I think it's toxic. It is creating more division rather than uniting us as one American melting pot. And so I want my children, I want the children in our community, in our state, in our country to realize what a precious gift they have been given to live in America, where we can be free.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Our next question is, what infrastructure in our district needs to be improved, and how would you pay for the improvements? Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Well, being out in the suburbs here, certainly roads are really important. We also are on a major metro line, and pre-COVID pandemic, it was one of the busiest metro lines of all the metro spokes emanating from Chicago. And so that's what I'm hearing a lot from residents, is they want roads that function. They want a rail system that works. Obviously, we're right in the shadow of O'Hare. And so that is a benefit to our residents and also our businesses that are here. The question is how to pay for it. And so one thing that I've, again, been a strong proponent of is that we allow these public works projects to be done more efficiently, because, again, as I said at the outset, when people are paying very, very high taxes, whether it's gas taxes, license fees, etc., they're not getting as much in return as other states are able to produce for the same amounts of tax revenue.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Candidate Trevor.
I think there are a couple of pressing needs in terms of public works projects. one that I see every day because I live in its shadow is Route 53, which was built the year that I was born. And I know from my work with the City of Rolling Meadows that there are several bridges that go through that are part of that stretch of road that desperately are in need of repair. As Tom also said, we have to focus on some of the public transportation things that we have, the rail lines, but also other aspects of public transportation I think are really, really critically important. Public transportation in the northwest suburbs is actually worse now in terms of bus routes than when I was a kid, which is a pretty amazing statement because we have far more people living out here now than we did 35, 40 years ago. So those to me are the big priorities, is making sure that our public transportation, rail and bus lines are adequately fixed, and also Route 53.
Thank you, candidate Trevor. Our next question is, what is your opinion on use of school facilities as it pertains to gender identity? Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
I agree with the policies that have been put in place in District 211. This is actually one of the issues that inspired me to run. I'm a product of the local public schools, and I also remember what it was like to grow up 40 years ago in a different time, in a different view of how kids who differed in terms of either gender identity or sexual orientation. I think that what 211 has done is keeping kids safe, despite the portrayal of transgender people as predators. The people who are most in danger in that situation are those kids that are a little different. So I think that they've done the right thing in supporting our kids.
Thank you, candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Well, what I did was I listened to parents and I listened to the students that were affected. And obviously there was not universal agreement on this, but I thought introducing a compromise proposal was the best way to go, to introduce a third space, which pretty much all of our schools already have. They have a coach's facility, they have a referee's locker room, so that the students who needed that privacy could get it, but so you would not have biological males having access to the female locker room or other changing areas. And so my compromise proposal was put aside because there was a very aggressive out of district response. And if you talk to most parents and students, they would say, you know what, that the compromise proposal was the better way to go. And so I'm trying to protect the privacy of our girls in particular. It doesn't matter, who the other student is or what their identity is. They have a right to privacy, and they should have that.
I would like to use my other rebuttal on this.
Go ahead.
The idea that, Tom, that you put forth a compromise I find to be disingenuous. You twice introduced discriminatory bathroom bills into the state legislature. And after almost losing to me in 2018, this past session, you introduced a bill to criminalize medically appropriate care to transgender youth. And the outside forces that came in to that fight also included Alliance Defending Freedom, which is listed as a hate group in Southern Poverty Law by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So no, you were not supporting a compromise.
Thank you, candidate Trevor. Our next question is, do you support raising the minimum wage to $15 per hour? Why or why not? Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Yeah, thank you. So I speak as a teenager who grew up earning the minimum wage on various jobs and gaining valuable experience along the way, learning to work as a team, learning to work under management, learning customer service skills. Artificially raising that minimum wage, all it does is it eliminates those lower rungs of the ladder for people who need a foot in the door. If that wage is artificially raised, it encourages automation for those positions. You can see it in the number of kiosks around restaurants and stores. You're eliminating positions, and it unfortunately drives up the unemployment rate for people who need that. Maybe they want to work part-time. Maybe they need it as a first job. As an employer, we always paid more than the minimum wage. And as our employees gained in skill and ability, we would pay them more because that's what a smart business does. You train your good people and you reward them appropriately.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Candidate Trevor.
I also, when I was in high school, worked for minimum wage, actually at Sears over in Woodfield. But back then, minimum wage relative to the cost of housing, to the cost of a college education, was much different. I was able to save the money that I earned, and it helped me get through college. And it was absolutely essential because my father passed away when I was 16 years old. And my mom still had 3 kids to get through college. So the money that I earned in those part-time jobs was really important. Nowadays, people earning minimum wage, it barely makes a dent in those things. And places like Walmart or other companies that pay minimum wage, essentially their workforces are being subsidized by public services, such as Medicaid. So it's costing us as taxpayers to not pay the minimum, to pay a substandard minimum wage. We need to bring that minimum wage gradually so that businesses can adjust, but we need to bring it back up to something close to paying off or paying for the cost of living.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Our next question is, what is your stance on deterrence, such as fees in lieu of units, to affordable housing and new construction? Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. What is your stance on deterrence, such as fees in lieu of units, to affordable housing and new construction?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I'm going to make a guess. And it has to do with basically how affordable housing is addressed in terms of policy. Whether or not you have developers pay fees as opposed to setting aside units. I think there are a lot of ways to approach it. I think it depends on the nature of the development, the local development and the needs of finding affordable housing in that area. But I think there are different ways to achieve that process. It all depends, like I said, it all depends on, I think, like on the density of housing, the current availability, the market price, the nature of the construction that's going on.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison.
Yeah, I too am a little puzzled by the gist of the question. I will say, however, when you're talking about the expense of housing in this area, you always have to look at the total cost to build and to operate that facility. And that has to do with property taxes primarily. And so until we address, what is driving the higher property taxes, it's things like pension reform, it's things like unfunded mandates that our state imposes on local units of government. It's things like a lack of reform on employer-employee policies. It's just driving up the cost of housing, and we've got to reform it to make to really move the needle on that issue.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Our next question is, what are your thoughts on the militarization of local police forces? Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Well, I try to do my best to talk to stakeholders as best as possible. So this question has come up a little bit after the 2 Gulf wars or the conflicts in the Middle East. A lot of that military equipment either was going to stay in the Middle East or it was going to come back home. And so our local units of government were given the opportunity to purchase some of those things. Now, if there's a legitimate use like a SWAT team, I see that as fine. Again, we as taxpayers paid for that equipment via our federal tax dollars. Of course, we need to do as much as possible to make sure that the people who work for municipal law enforcement, that our residents feel safe, that their civil liberties are not violated. But with the increasing attacks on law enforcement, I want to make sure that they are safe when necessary. If there was a a horrific domestic violence incident, we need to make sure that law enforcers are protected.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Candidate Trevor.
I've lived in a community where relationship between the community and the police was strained, and it's not a good situation for the community because people tend to be reluctant to call police when they actually need them, and it also creates, I think, risks for the police. Right now, I think I live in a community that, by and large, does a good job with it. I'm actually a big fan of the Rolling Meadows Police Department and the work they've done in the community to build relationships. But given that, I think that we have to be very careful about equipping our police departments, both here and around the country, with military-style equipment. Local police are not an occupying army. We need to make sure that we foster relationships between the police and the communities that they serve, not put them in positions of doing shows of force.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Our next question is, what changes, if any, do you see as necessary to Illinois state employment laws to best balance the interests of the gig platform providers, their few full-time and many part-time workers, as well as the consumer? Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
Yeah, that's something that I actually have some experience with, both being in the position of having to contract out my services and also working, in management in a company in Silicon Valley, which actually does rely a lot on gig workers. And I think there is a dangerous line that's been crossed by a lot of firms that are essentially their business model is to skirt employment law and the protections that workers have. We need to very carefully define, what's appropriate for full-time employment and the benefits that are associated with it, and contract work, and clarify that. And I think California's made some progress on that. But we cannot use this new trend as a way to undermine employment law, which is what's going on now.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison.
Yeah, I think as best as possible, government should keep a light hand in this situation, let market forces dictate a lot of this. A lot of gig workers do it because it gives them the flexibility that they want. If there's a gig employer or a gig platform that is not treating its gig workers well, then you're going to see people flee from that from those opportunities. And so it's really amazing what technology has enabled us to do, and we just take so much of it for granted. And if the state government puts too heavy of a hand in it, it's just going to limit choices for consumers and also those gig workers that want the freedom and flexibility to perform those services.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Our next question is, what is your plan for passing legislation to reduce property taxes? Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
Actually, I thought it was Tom's turn.
I'm so sorry. Hard to keep track of everything. Yes, Candidate Morrison, thank you so much for pointing that out.
Sure. Yeah, I've addressed it already, but it bears repeating again. We have to do things like pension reform at the local level. We have to look at things like local government consolidation, or at least making state law enable our local governments to do more cooperative activities rather than duplication of efforts. We've got to reduce unfunded mandates. We've got to encourage more businesses and taxpayers to move into our communities. When you see empty storefronts, all that is going to be is a shifting of that property tax burden onto the other residents and the other businesses that are within that jurisdiction. And so when we lose taxpayers, when we lose a business, when a business closes because of a state government mandate, and we're going to see thousands of Illinois businesses that are either have closed or will soon be closing because of state government mandates, that is going to shift the property tax burden onto every other property tax payer in that jurisdiction, and it's wrong.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Now, Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
Okay, I think that I'm losing track of the trunk question here, but you were specifically asking about what we could do as state legislators to keep property taxes low. And I think that one of the things that we can do is better fund education at the state level. However, one of the wrinkles that we have is property taxes are determined at the local level. That we need to provide some incentives for local school boards to hold those property taxes in check if in fact we give them the resources at the state level to help fund education. So some of that might be some kind of rebate program. So that might be sort of changing some of the rules that we have that, you know, require them or let them raise taxes up to a certain point without referendum, and creates incentives to take the maximum that they can every year. Perhaps letting them bank that or something like that to try and give them some reason to hold property taxes low at the local level.
All right, thank you, Candidate Trevor. And just as a general reminder, if either of you need a question to be repeated, you can ask that at any time, and I will happily do so. With that being said, our next question is, please clarify your views on responsible gun legislation. Candidate Trevor, you have a minute to respond.
You know, one of the interesting things that happened to me 10, 15 years ago was a conversation with my mother where she revealed to me that my father was a gun owner, which I did not know growing up. It's because he was a responsible gun owner. And what we need to do in terms of and I'm not against gun ownership for self-defense and sporting purposes, but we need to hold both gun owners and manufacturers liable for responsible behavior. That means adequately licensing and regulating gun sales so that we can keep track of them and make sure that guns stay out of the hands of people who should not have them. I also think there is no good reason for weapons that can fire large amounts of ammunition quickly. There's no sporting reason for it. There is no civilian self-defense reason for it. And I am for regulation of firearms that would reduce that kind of capacity.
Thank you, Candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison.
Yeah, I think we're seeing it play out in society today. There are people who will do very evil things with whatever means necessary, regardless of what the law is. And so we already have a number of state laws dealing with gun ownership, gun purchasing, the handling of guns. We have federal laws as well. And it still comes down to what an individual's intent is. And if they're intent on doing something evil, in harming others, in threatening others, we have to use existing laws to come down very, very hard on those violent, dangerous individuals. The shootings that we all read about so often, right in Chicago and even in some of the nearby suburbs, that's gang violence. That's gang violence. They're fighting over turf. They're engaged in illicit activity, usually drug deals, and they're using whatever means necessary to protect that turf, even if innocent victims are in harm's way.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Our next question will be our last question. So the question is, what is your opinion on legislation that forces a particular, let me start that over, I deeply apologize. What is your opinion on legislation that encompasses a particular religious view on everyone? Candidate Morrison, you have a minute to respond.
Again, not sure the intent of that question, but one of our precious freedoms enshrined in the Bill of Rights is freedom of religion. And so we are a very pluralistic country. You have people of many different faiths or no faith that are engaged in the civic sphere in elected office. So we have opportunities for people to exercise their religion or their religious beliefs or not, and that has to be protected.
Thank you, Candidate Morrison. Candidate Trevor.
The Northwest suburbs are an incredibly diverse place, particularly religiously, and that is a strength. But we live in it. We in this country, one of the key components of our civic life is the separation between church and state, which I think is critical to maintaining religious freedom in this country. And therefore, that's a line I draw. We need to make sure that we do not have any kind of litmus test for religious beliefs on public office, and we need to make sure that we do not legislate religious beliefs into law in this country and in this state.
All right, thank you so much for your responses to your questions. We will now proceed with our closing statements. Candidate Trevor, you will have 2 minutes to make a closing statement.
In my opening statement, I talked a lot about the qualifications I feel I have to be a state legislator. I do have the background in many, many fields to understand healthcare, to understand education. That's not really in and of itself what inspired me to run. I never, ever imagined myself doing this, even just 4 years ago. The reason why I did this is because I felt that we were being represented by somebody in the state legislature who was out of touch with our district's views. I grew up here. I remember what it was like here. I remember the political battles that were fought to make this a strong, diverse community. And I am not comfortable being represented by somebody who opposes women's rights, who opposes women's reproductive rights, who has on several occasions introduced discriminatory legislation against the LGBTQ community, who has twice introduced voter ID laws into the state legislature. This is not who we are as a district. I will fight for healthcare. I will fight for education. I will also fight for equal rights. I will fight for women's reproductive rights. I will fight for people's right to vote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Candidate Trevor. Candidate Morrison, you have 2 minutes to make a closing statement.
All right. Well, thank you once again for having me on this. I'm running for re-election because what we need in Illinois is a counterbalance to a corrupt and powerful Cook County machine that continues to run the entire state of Illinois, that has pushed a far left agenda, which again, if Maggie Trevor were to represent this area, she would just continue to push those policies that I think are harmful. Ultimately, I try to listen to my constituents as best as possible. You won't see a more accessible, responsive state legislature than me. I knock on thousands of doors. I talk to my constituents. We can have a healthy discussion and a disagreement on things. But I've been elected and reelected, even in the face of enormous opposition last time. I was the one Republican victory. Why? Because I know this district. I was kind of caught off guard. I never imagined facing almost $2 million in political money and muscle being waged in a district about the size of Palatine Township, but we overcame, and we're gonna win again this time, because what these residents, being a father of 4, seeing how the lockdowns have affected families and small businesses, and people do not want just one person or a handful of people from J.B. Pritzker to Mike Madigan dictating to all of our state's residents how their lives are going to be lived. On some of the other issues that Maggie Trevor brought up, again, I listen to parents. I'm trying to protect minors from making life-altering decisions without having their parents involved. I mean, one of the issues that she's pushing is getting rid of the parental notification law for minors. I think that's wrong. So I am happy to engage with any of the residents after this discussion and debate, and I look forward to continuing to represent our district. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to the both of the candidates. I will now pass this off back to Louisa.
Thank you, Felix, for being our moderator. Please make sure to register to vote, make a plan to vote, and then make sure your voice is counted this election day. Need help? League of Women's Voters, Arlington Heights, Mount Prospect, Buffalo Grove is here to help. Check out our website at www.lwvah.org for our voter registration information. Yes, you can register online. Mail-in vote information, secure Dropbox location, planning your ballot, those judges matter, as well as your early and day of polling locations. And for any of you looking to support this year's election to make sure it's safe, secure, and accessible for all, we even have a link where you can sign up to be a poll worker and even earn a little extra cash. Students, it's a day off school. Again, check us out at www.lwvah.org and follow us on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We even have accounts specifically for youth at student.lwvah and a mascot at Pause for Votes. And make sure once you're ready to vote, you tell 10 friends where they can find all the information they need to be counted. www.lwvah.org. We are grateful to all of you for joining us and to our candidates, Tom Morrison and Maggie Trevor. Our democracy relies on citizens willing to run for office. To our ASL interpreter, Stacy Sheen Stapleton, and to all our volunteers of our league who work tirelessly to bring you this free program. Have a great day. Maybe we'll see you back here at 3 p.m. for our Illinois Congressional District 9 Forum.
Thank you.